15 years ago, Mira Devlin had stood on a national stage, flushed with heat under the lights, as critics called her a voice to watch, a playwright with a gift for emotional layering, and a director who could pull magic from silence. She had been headed somewhere, until the betrayal. Now, at 47, Mira's name lingered mostly on the edges of old programs and outdated course syllabi. She taught at Hartley Conservatory, a small art school tucked in the shadow of better-funded programs. It was the kind of place students applied to with modest dreams and second-choice scholarships. But Mira had carved out something sacred here. She poured herself into the work, not for glory, but for clarity. The classroom was the only place she didn't feel erased. She'd never told anyone, not even the faculty friends who drifted in and out of her office with coffee and gossip, what really happened with Julian Cross. Once her star student, Julian had been hungry, brilliant, and, for a time, deeply devoted to her. She had taken him under her wing, workshopped his scenes, shared her journals, even let him direct one of her most personal plays for a showcase she couldn't attend due to a family emergency. By the time she returned, the industry buzz had already begun, and her words, her title, even her themes, were now his. He'd repackaged her most vulnerable script into his debut feature-length production, changed just enough details to avoid legal blowback, and climbed the ladder she built for him without looking back. When she privately confronted him, he'd said, with chilling calm, "You're the one who taught me the work is bigger than the ego. I'm just honoring the material." She never worked again in a serious venue. People stopped returning her calls. Slowly, the rejection stopped being sharp. It became part of the air. And now, Hartley Conservatory had invited him to guest direct the end-of-year showcase. She found out the same way the students did, via bulletin board, a poster with his face on it, chin resting on knuckles, under the tagline, "Julian Cross returns to Hartley." Mira stared at it for a long time. Her office window overlooked the same board where it hung, and each time she passed, she felt the tightness grow. She said nothing. Not to the department head, who admired Julian's career momentum, not to the students who buzzed about his latest streaming deal, and not even when Julian himself stopped by her office, unannounced the day he arrived, carrying a takeaway coffee and an easy smile. He said her name like it still meant something. She kept her hands folded on the desk and asked if he'd like to sit. He declined, scanned the old production posters on her walls, and mentioned how full circle it felt. Before he left, he added with practiced humility that he hoped she'd give him honest feedback if she had time to observe rehearsals. She only said, "Of course." That night, she unlocked her storage cabinet and pulled out the original draft of Grief Season, the play she had never submitted, never published, and never spoken of again. Her handwriting still marked the edges, crossed out lines, notes to herself, moments of rawness that had never been meant for anyone else. She laid it flat on her desk and stared at the date. There it was, 2010. Her last year on a stage that mattered. Mira didn't believe in comebacks, but she did believe in rehearsals. Slow, measured, precise. And she knew that in the right hands, a performance could hold a mirror up so sharp it cut. The students Julian selected were promising but unformed, eager to please, easily impressed, and starstruck. He ran them like a motivational speaker, full of charm and anecdote. But Mira knew the difference between technique and charisma. She began sitting in the back of the theater, scribbling notes. At first, just watching. Then suggesting, softly, casually, when students asked for help between scenes. By the third week, the students were showing up at her office, scripts in hand. Julian said this scene needs more heat. What does that mean? I don't get my character's arc in Act 2. Can you help? She never undermined him. She simply illuminated the text, asked questions he hadn't. In quiet ways, the performance began to bend toward truth, not his truth. Heron. By the 5th week of rehearsals, the shift was undeniable. Julian still commanded the room with his polished ease and industry anecdotes, but the texture of the performances was changing. What began as light mimicry of his direction was evolving into something deeper, rawer, and more precise. Things he hadn't asked for, but couldn't quite correct without looking petty. Mira never gave the students direct instructions during rehearsal. That would have been a line crossed. Instead, she worked quietly, outside the spotlight, mostly in the early mornings or after hours. They came to her one by one, some to ask for emotional clarity, others just to talk. She listened, nudged, never imposed, but always she returned them to the heart of the scene, the part Julian didn't seem able or willing to find. He was good with movement, blocking, the visual rhythm of a piece. But when students struggled with subtext or emotional logic, he fell back on generalities. Trust the energy. Feel it in your spine. Let the tension ride. To the wide-eyed second years, it sounded poetic. But for students serious about the craft, it eventually rang hollow. Mira began to notice it first in the girl playing the lead, a transfer student named Cass. Brilliant instincts, unsure of her voice. Cass had asked Julian if her character's breakdown in Scene 5 made sense given her earlier composure. Julian had waved it off. Don't overthink it, he said. Just commit. Cass came to Mira 2 days later, unsure how to commit to something she didn't believe. Mira didn't rewrite the scene or feed her lines. She simply asked Cass to write a private journal entry from the character's point of view. No pressure, no right answer, just empathy. When Cass read the entry aloud the next day, she began crying halfway through. Not from drama, truth. Julian wasn't there, but the performance she gave that week began shaping the spine of the entire production. Other students followed. A quiet boy named Theo, whose performance had felt stiff and surface level, began working with Mira on breath control and character motivation. A small scene between him and Cass, originally forgettable, started drawing spontaneous applause during internal run-throughs. Julian noticed. At first, he complimented them. You're finally unlocking it, he told them with a proud smile. But something in his posture shifted. He lingered after rehearsals now, watching them talk to Mira. Once, he walked in on her, giving Cass a note about pacing in a monologue, and stood silently at the back, arms folded, saying nothing. When she noticed, she simply nodded. He didn't nod back. The students didn't see the growing tension between the two of them, but Mira did, and Julian did. There was no need to speak of it. They were both directors. They knew the rules of silence, how to shape a performance without dialogue. She started noticing his rehearsals becoming more controlling. He'd give longer, more abstract notes, push students to stick to his original vision. He called for extra runs, made them rehearse beats that were already strong, insisted on small rewrites for pacing. The students grew confused. They weren't sure who to trust. Some of them started second-guessing their instincts. That was when Mira did something small, but pivotal. She brought in a single-page copy of an old article from the New York Stage Review, written during her early success. She left it on the common room table with no name on it, just the text. The article quoted a then-rising playwright speaking about character silence as a form of revelation. It used phrases Mira had written in the margins of her old notebooks, phrases Julian had once borrowed. She watched Cass pick it up during a break, read it, then look over at her. "This sounds like you," she said quietly. Mira said nothing. She didn't have to. By the time Julian scheduled a full preview rehearsal for faculty and invited guests, the dynamic was fragile. His control was slipping. The students were still loyal to him publicly, but behind the scenes, their confidence in his direction wavered. And the work, shaped not just by technique but truth, had begun to reflect something more layered than he seemed able to hold. Mira didn't want to destroy him. She wanted him to be seen, really seen. And she knew the best mirror was always held steady. The week before the showcase, Mira became nearly invisible on paper. She stopped attending rehearsals. She didn't return student emails. Even her office door remained shut more often than not. But in truth, her influence had already been threaded through the seams of the work. The foundation was laid, quietly, methodically, and now she let it breathe. Julian, sensing her absence, regained his footing with the students. He doubled down on formalities, insisting on structured warm-ups and stricter calls. He gave motivational speeches before each run, laced with self-reference. To the administration, everything looked polished. He updated the department head regularly, reminding them of his time constraints, his generosity, his commitment to giving back. But something had shifted in the students. They still followed his instructions, but they were no longer searching for his approval. They had started searching for truth within the performance itself. There were questions now, tension in their eyes, and in the quiet hours, they had begun revisiting Mira's notes, not formally, but instinctively. They repeated things she'd asked them to consider weeks earlier. Why would this character hesitate here? What's the memory beneath the line? Cass had started recording her rehearsals and watching them back alone, taking notes not on staging, but on emotional rhythm. Theo had rewritten 3 pages of internal monologue, not changing the words, but layering his own context beneath the silence. The entire cast was performing a version of Julian's show, yes, but filtered through a lens he had not crafted. Julian noticed. The first time he snapped, it was subtle. A comment during warm-ups directed at Cass. "Let's stop layering subtext where it doesn't belong. Simplicity is strength, not a crutch." She didn't respond, just blinked slowly and nodded. But Mira was in the hallway that day, just outside the rehearsal room, listening. She didn't enter. She didn't need to. By now, the students were no longer just emulating a guest director. They were discovering themselves as artists. It was messy, yes, but it was also alive in ways Julian's vision could not contain. Mira had given them permission, not instruction. And the difference was beginning to show. The administration, meanwhile, was thrilled. Tickets for the showcase were selling faster than usual, thanks to Julian's name and the anticipation of a high-profile return. The local arts blog planned to attend, as did 2 minor theater critics. Julian was courting them carefully, arranging backstage interviews, supplying pre-written bios. His narrative was set, a triumphant homecoming, a brilliant new generation guided by his hand. What he didn't realize, what he couldn't see, was that Mira had already begun reshaping that narrative in small, deliberate ways. 3 students, independently of one another, had reached out to a semi-retired theater blogger Mira had once mentored. They'd discovered her name mentioned in old reviews, ones Julian never cited, and tracked the blog down out of curiosity. The blogger, intrigued by the connections, began pulling at threads. Mira hadn't said a word to him, but the students had, not with malice, but wonder. Did you know Julian's early work was almost identical to this older director's writing? The blogger hadn't. But he started looking. And then there was the script itself, still credited to Julian, but rewritten enough to feel disjointed. The core emotional beats no longer matched the structure. Characters reacted to things the audience didn't witness. Motives felt incomplete. The students had compensated with presence, with emotional honesty, but underneath, the flaws in authorship had begun to show. By the final dress rehearsal, Julian was tense. He stopped watching the whole performance and began focusing on micronotes, a hand movement, a pause, a costume detail. It was his way of reclaiming control. But the students were no longer waiting for cues. They were following an emotional map that Julian had never fully drawn, and one Mira had quietly restored. On the final night before the showcase, Cass knocked on Mira's door. She looked tired, but clear-eyed. "He's trying to flatten it," she said. "He doesn't know what this play is anymore." Mira waited. Cass hesitated. Then, "Can I show you something?" She pulled out a printed copy of the current script, Julian's version, and laid it next to the old article Mira had left in the common room weeks ago. "I didn't say anything before," Cass murmured, "but the rhythms are the same, the cadences, even some of the pauses." Mira didn't confirm it. She only looked at the script, then at Cass, and said gently, "If the story's true, it doesn't need to be explained. It just needs to be shown." Cass exhaled, nodded slowly, and left. That night, Mira returned to the rehearsal room long after everyone had gone. She walked the stage in silence, stood at center, and imagined it under lights again. She didn't want applause. She didn't even want recognition. She wanted to restore the balance. And tomorrow, in front of an audience, the story would speak for itself. The house was full. The air held that particular pressure only theater people recognize, an audience that matters. Faculty lined the front rows, flanked by regional critics and minor arts bloggers. Former alumni mingled with local press. The theater hummed with anticipation, the kind that could turn either direction, triumph or disappointment. Backstage, Julian moved with forced calm. He wore a navy turtleneck and blazer, understated but carefully selected. Every nod to the press, every handshake with old colleagues was rehearsed. The narrative was near complete, a celebrated protege returning to guide the next generation. But the cast didn't seem to be performing that story anymore. They were quiet in the dressing rooms, not nervous, not scattered, but distant, focused. Mira had not attended the dress rehearsal, nor had she made herself visible in the hours leading up to curtain. And yet her presence was felt in the small rituals the students carried out. Breathing together before stepping into the wings, sketching emotional timelines on note cards, whispering character thoughts before the first line. These were her fingerprints, invisible but unmistakable. Julian stood in the tech booth for the opening. The lights dimmed, the audience hushed, and the first scene began. At first, everything looked as expected: blocking, transitions, costuming, even the rhythm. But as the performance unfolded, a subtle divergence revealed itself. Cass, who'd once followed Julian's direction with almost theatrical precision, began breaking silences in unexpected places, pausing just a beat longer than scripted, allowing emotion to rise and fall organically. Theo's line deliveries weren't punchy anymore. They were restrained, simmering, pregnant with implication. Minor characters leaned into contradiction. Conflict played out not just in the dialogue, but in the moments between. Julian watched, jaw tight. It was his show, but it wasn't his. The structure remained intact, But the spirit, the emotional core, was something else entirely. And the more he tried to deny it, the more obvious it became. Then came Scene 5, the emotional climax, the one Cass had once questioned. Her character's sudden breakdown, originally staged as a theatrical burst of grief, came instead as a quiet collapse. She didn't cry on cue. She sat downstage, eyes unfocused, letting the silence hold the weight. No music swelled, no spotlight emphasized her, but the room held its breath. The lines, his lines, came hollow from her mouth, reinterpreted through a lens of quiet devastation. Julian had insisted that scene end with a scream, but Cass ended it with a whisper, and it landed. The audience erupted in stillness, the rarest kind of silence, the kind born of being disarmed. Julian looked to the audience, expecting confusion. Instead, he saw still eyes, some glassy, others locked in. And then came the final sequence, a brief monologue by a supporting character, Theo's role, delivered under minimal lighting. He stepped forward and broke the fourth wall, not with force, but with intimacy. "We spend our lives pretending we wrote the story," he said, "but sometimes we're just walking through someone else's pages." It was still Julian's script, technically, but Mira's voice bled through the page, ghost-like, impossible to credit, impossible to ignore. When the curtain fell, the audience applauded immediately. Not explosive, not polite. Sustained, thoughtful, deeply moved. Julian walked on stage with the cast, beaming. The students clapped for him as trained, and the audience followed. He took a shallow bow, glancing back at the actors. But Cass didn't look at him, nor did Theo. They looked out into the audience, toward the woman standing in the back row. Mira had entered during the second act. She didn't applaud. She simply nodded once, then turned to leave. Outside, near the stage door, a young critic from the arts blog was already writing his first note. Not about Julian's direction, but about a performance that recalled the lost poetics of Mira Hallberg's early work, layered in tone and restraint. Another critic, older, sharper, whispered to his companion, "Didn't this feel lifted? Like someone else was speaking through it?" And upstairs, in the lobby, a retired blogger from the early 2000s pulled out a dog-eared review of a play Mira had written 20 years ago. He held it next to Julian's program. The titles were different, but the monologue on page 9, word for word. Julian didn't know it yet, but the unraveling had already begun. Not through confrontation, not through scandal, but through echoes. Too precise to ignore, too familiar to explain away. The audience wouldn't be scandalized. They would be curious. And in the silence that followed, curiosity would become suspicion, then conversation, then remembering. And Mira's name, long erased, would find its way back, not in flashing lights, but in quiet, enduring recognition. The showcase ended, but its ripple had only begun. In the week that followed, Mira stayed distant, declining interviews and leaving emails unanswered. Her return wasn't to be managed. It wasn't a comeback tour or a public statement. It was an unfolding, something quieter and slower, like water returning to a dried-up well. The students, however, didn't move on so quickly. Cass and Theo began receiving messages from industry mentors and acting schools. Their performances had landed with a precision few expected from undergraduates. One casting assistant called Cass's final scene the most restrained and brutal grief I've seen on a student stage. She didn't mention Julian's name once. Julian tried to reclaim control in the immediate aftermath. He posted photos with the cast, tagging them all, writing long captions about the joy of mentorship and the brilliance of his students. But comments were minimal. One post went semi-viral, not because of his words, but because a theater blog reposted it with a caption. Funny. Some of these lines feel lifted from Mira Hallberg's 2007 staging notes. Then came the article, not from a scandal rag, from the semi-retired blogger Mira once mentored. It wasn't accusatory. It was reflective, almost elegiac. A timeline of Mira's early career, the uncredited similarities in Julian's debut, the vanished script drafts, the way her name faded just as his began to rise. It didn't scream theft. It just asked a question. What do we lose when we stop remembering who the stories belonged to first? Within days, the theater community started whispering, then quoting. Mira's name began appearing again, not in headlines, but in footnotes, in Instagram stories, in panel discussions about forgotten voices in contemporary theater. A small literary journal reprinted one of her old essays. Her out-of-print monologue collection quietly sold out on a used book site. Julian never addressed the article publicly. He couldn't. It was too well documented, too calm. It didn't accuse. It revealed. And in that restraint, it left him with nothing to fight. The real shift, though, came from the students. Cass was interviewed on a niche acting podcast. When asked about her process, she didn't mention Julian's direction. Instead, she spoke of a quiet presence who taught us to see the work, not just perform it. Someone who reminded us that honesty isn't always loud. Theo began quoting Mira's teaching in his own rehearsals. He didn't make a spectacle of it. He simply passed her wisdom forward. That spring, a small off-Broadway collective announced they would stage a reimagined version of The Clearing, one of Mira's early works, long buried and never formally published. They credited her by name. When asked for comment, she only sent a short note to the director. Let the work speak. It always knows its way home. As for Julian, offers slowed. Not dramatically, not scandalously, just cooled. Invitations were phrased more cautiously. Former colleagues answered his emails a little later than before. And when one casting director called to ask a mutual friend about working with him, she paused before saying, "He's talented, but the stories don't feel like his anymore." That line stuck. It wasn't a takedown. It wasn't revenge in the way people often imagine it. Loud, explosive, final. It was a quiet dismantling, the kind built on patience, intelligence, and the integrity of truth. Mira had no need to shout. She'd made a mirror and simply held it up. In time, Julian would either retreat or reconfigure. But whatever he chose, the silence around him had changed. It no longer protected him. It questioned him. And Mira? She remained where she was, still at the modest drama school, still teaching scenes in the black box theater with mismatched chairs, still asking questions rather than giving instructions. But now, when her name appeared on a student's resume, it meant something again. Not because she reclaimed it, but because she let the truth reclaim her.